Good morning and welcome to our Safety Connection Hazard Assessment for Agriculture. A note that this session will be recorded for viewing in our resource section in the future. It is my pleasure to host and facilitate with my colleague and friend, Jay Remzik, this morning. My name is Kristen Hoffman. I'm a consultant with Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, WSPS. We are a not-for-profit organization with the commitment to protecting employees and operations in Ontario and beyond. We are a proud partner in the Ontario Occupational Health and Safety and Prevention System, and we offer health and safety expertise, consulting, training, and resources, and events such as this Safety Connection. This morning, our conversation will focus on agriculture. We will describe the process to recognize through to manage hazards that we may encounter within this sector. And we will take some opportunity to get to know you a little better and the type of operation that you represent, which may then tailor the hazard conversation that we have through the session. Here are a few tips for you before we begin the session. It is recommended for audio to use headset or earbud attachments. If there is a concern with your audio and truly any of the accessibility within this platform, log yourself out through the leave button and return. Typically that refresh will refresh those settings. We'll ask if you are able to mute any of your other devices, and your audio will be on mute through the session. That will help to avoid distractions. You do have access to the chat within the platform. Across the top ribbon of the Teams screen, you will notice the icon for chat. We welcome you and encourage you to chat with us through the session, and we may have a few questions for you to respond within the chat as well. To use that chat function, which may be familiar for some and others not, this is where you will enter your questions, comments, and of course, at the end of the session, if there is further interest for contact with us, we welcome you to make that note at the end and we will make a point to contact you. You are able to expand each pane of the screen that you are viewing. If you wish, through the settings, you can adjust the view with the 3 ellipses or dots across that top ribbon, opening up and selecting to enter full screen and escaping out at any point if you wish. Although we will not use poll function within this session, we are going to encourage you to use the chat a couple of times throughout the session once more to get to know you just a little better. The goals and purpose of events such as this Safety Connection are truly to stay in touch, to reach out and connect with each other in the sector and on the topic of interest. It also provides you in a virtual setting the opportunity to attend from anywhere within the province. Through this session, we hope to exchange some best practices as well as requirements and recommendations related to hazard management for agriculture and learn something new that is of importance and value to you and the operation that you represent. To begin to get to know each other just a little bit better, in the chat, if you would not mind to share what type of operation are you joining us from? Do you operate a dairy or work within a greenhouse? Is it flower or vegetable? Perhaps field crop of some type, vineyards and otherwise. Within agriculture, we have the beauty of diversity in our commodities, from livestock through to crops of all different types. Thank you. Many greenhouses, lovely, from flower to vegetable, cannabis, field crop. Those who support agriculture, perhaps through consulting and retail as well. Thank you so much for that. It is my pleasure to begin to introduce Jay Remzik, who will facilitate the content from this point. Jay and I have had the opportunity to work together and support agriculture for many years. Jay will break it right down to the number of years, months, weeks, and days, I feel like, but it has certainly been a while. And both of us have passion for this sector and understand the importance to manage the hazards that may be present within this sector. Jay?
Thanks, Kristen. And I won't break it down into days, hours, and seconds, but I will say that for myself, yes, in July of this year, it'll be 25 years that I've been doing this, and my primary area of, expertise is in the agricultural sector. I saw in the chat there some of the participants or attendees had mentioned where they're coming from or where they're working at, and do a lot of work down in the Leamington and Kingsville area with greenhouse operations. And I saw one of the ag retailers that we've done some work with. So vast amount of knowledge in regards to the sector. And as Kristen had mentioned in the opening, that this is a hazard assessment for agriculture safety connection. So we're going to talk about hazard assessments in general, but just to try to put a little bit of an agricultural spin or twist on it. Just before we do commence, because I did see in the chat, I'll just ask Kristen, maybe you can just wave. You can hear me, correct? Okay, great. And then I see that one participant now has just logged back in. So hopefully the audio is working for all. So we will, thank you. There's a thumbs up. So let's talk about, hi, Aaron. Let's talk about a hazard assessment, okay? It's a means to identify hazards within your workplace or work tasks and quantify how dangerous they are and determine where workers could potentially be injured. Kristen has done these. I've done these as well in regards to hazard assessments, or what WSPS refers to as hazard identification and risk assessments. And some businesses, when we've gone in to conduct these hazard assessments, they might maybe do it by department, but most of the time or whatever, when we're out and we're doing that work, it's about what that individual is doing. So whether it is a forklift operator, whether it's an order picker, someone working within the greenhouse, let's say on the scissor lift and picking produce, or you've got an individual that's operating a tractor, for field work. So we're looking at all the hazards that are associated with that particular task. You may have different terms as it's being referenced to here on the slide, whether it's a risk registry or a risk and hazard inventory or a hazard list. But all that information that you're gathering, we don't necessarily need to be concerned with the term. We want to be able to identify, right? What are those potential hazards that could be in the workplace, so that we're aware of that and that we can put the proper controls in place. So the question is we already have a good safety program. Do I need a hazard assessment? And what this is it's a baseline rather than a reactive hazard management. So that inventory of potential hazards is captured to allow the business to focus on what resources need to be allocated to reduce the risk of accident or injury. Some of the bullet points that it's referencing there in regards to not having a hazard assessment, well, it's control scattering approach. An incident occurs, and then that's when we're scrambling and then we're putting the control in. Missing certain hazards entirely or treating all hazards equally. And we know that all hazards are not going to be, we don't want them to be treated equally. Failing to prioritize or given priority to lower risks over higher ones. And we'll speak to that as we go through the presentation in regards to prioritizing these hazards once we've identified them. Putting controls in place that do not offer adequate risk reduction or failing to consider the hierarchy of controls. Inspect, meet, and repeat. And then as crisis management, okay, instead of hazard management. So one of the key things in regards to conducting a hazard assessment is to identify, again, all those hazards that could be present within the particular workplace. We speak to lagging versus leading indicators. So a lagging indicator is data points that identify a hazard after, right, the incident occurs. The leading indicator, right, data points that identify a hazard before the incident occurs. And we want to focus in on those, those leading indicators, because as it references there, an incident, okay, it's an occurrence or occurrences arising out of or in the course of work that could or does result in injury or ill health. Okay, and identifying risk proactively is a leading indicator. Okay, our incident causation model. You can see here that we've got inadequate controls. And those inadequate controls could be, a breakdown in the system, roles and responsibilities of all workplace parties, compliance. Are we meeting legislative compliance? Underlying causes we factor in, individual factors. Is the particular staff member, is the worker, are they adhering and following the rules? Immediate causes, substandard acts, practices, at-risk behavior. Do we have proper standard operating procedures or safe work procedures in place? The event, the incident, okay, potential loss or producing loss event, and then our loss is unintended harm or damage. Okay, but as we work through this, and we see that there's our inadequate controls, our underlying causes, immediate causes, the event, and then potentially a loss. It allows us to go work through a problem-solving model to ensure that we have identified, to ensure proper policies are in place, training has been provided to the workers to reduce, right, those hazards that could arise within the workplace. The internal responsibility system, I'm sure that everybody in attending is aware of this, but it is the foundation of health and safety law in Ontario. The Occupational Health and Safety Act sets out duties and responsibilities for both the employer, the supervisor, and the worker. And it is your Joint Health and Safety Committee or your health and safety representative that is monitoring that system to ensure that we have a strong functioning IRS within the business. Very similar when I'm out and I'm doing on-site training or doing virtual training. In regards to the IRS, I always speak to the fact that yes, the employer does he or she have the most responsibility. As is mentioned there, they're required to ensure that they have the proper policies in place. They're putting the program in place. It starts at the top. Supervisors, they are the eyes and ears of the employer when that individual possibly is not around. They're ensuring that the staff members, the associates, the workers are complying with the rules, policies and procedures within the workplace. And I think it's very important as well to remind our staff members, workers, that they have a legal duty and responsibility to ensure that they are adhering to not only the Occupational Health and Safety Act, but also policies and procedures within that particular workplace. And to tie this into identifying hazards, we do know that Joint Health and Safety Committee or a health and safety representative, worker representatives on the Joint Health and Safety Committee, they are required to conduct monthly workplace inspections. So that is something that is set in legislation that needs to be done on a monthly basis. But when I'm doing certification training, as an example, I always say to the attendees, particularly the worker representatives, that when they're conducting that workplace inspection, that is a snapshot in time, the day that they're conducting that inspection. I like to call it a takeaway or a debrief, that when they get back to their particular workplace, they should be reminding, the employer, as well as the supervisor, to remind those particular workers that are not on the Joint Health and Safety Committee that they have a legal duty and responsibility to report a hazard. That if they see a hazard, they have to report that to their employer and supervisor. So to tie it back to, hazard assessments and identifying hazards, when we talk about the internal responsibility system, it is everybody's responsibility for health and safety. Okay, the committee or the health and safety representative, they're monitoring that system to ensure that it is effective. But all three parties that is represented there on the slide in regards to, employer, supervisor, and worker, they need to ensure that they're not only controlling hazards, but also reporting those hazards to the employer if it is the worker. So the role of the committee, as I had mentioned, they're identifying workplace health and safety concerns, assisting the employer in prioritizing the hazards. And I should, just mention this right now, that when we're talking about hazard assessments or a HERA, this doesn't solely fall upon the Joint Health and Safety Committee or the health and safety representative, but they're assisting. Okay, so some businesses that I've worked with, yes, they do have their committee conduct hazard assessments, but it's not necessarily a requirement. Okay, they are required to conduct those monthly workplace inspections, but they could be involved. They could be providing their input, their feedback. If the employer, let's say, has a supervisor conduct the hazard assessment, or a third party comes in to conduct that hazard assessment, but that's also then assisting them to prioritize. Monitoring that IRS and the implementation of the programs, and then making recommendations for program improvement and implementing controls. We're going to talk here about the hazard categories, and there's not only the health hazards, the potential to cause illness, disease, or other health conditions. I'm thinking, somebody working around, a grain elevator. One of the terms that is commonly used in the agricultural sector is farmer's lung, that if I'm not properly protected with, the proper personal protective equipment, over time, I could develop some type of respiratory illness. And then we'll also speak to safety hazards that have the potential to cause an injury. Right? Here are our 6 hazard categories. We break them down into safety hazards. We have physical hazards. We have chemical, biological, MSD, and psychosocial. And we have on our next slide we're going to use the chat, and I'm just going to open up the chat. A noisy box making machine. What hazard category do you feel that would fall into? Would that be safety, MSD? So I see health. So one individual, here we go. Yep, they're coming in. We've got, yes, correct. A noisy box making machine would be classified as a physical hazard. So physical hazards are noise, and I'll still continue to use the chat. We have noise as one, but what other classifications could fall into physical? Wonder if anyone knows. We've got noise. Anything else? Okay, smell. Hot glue. Okay, yeah. So the hot glue, I'll take the hot. Physical hazards are the following. That would be noise. It could be temperature. So it could be heat or cold. Vibration, and radiation. And in particular, when I'm out and I'm conducting sessions on site with various farms throughout southwestern Ontario, I do use this slide, and I'll ask the participants, okay, so physical hazards. Do you need to be worried about physical hazards? And a lot of the times individuals think, oh, well, physical hazards is I'm using a ladder and I fall off the ladder and I'm going to break my arm. It's a physical injury. No, we're going to speak to heat, cold, noise, radiation, and vibration. And we talked then with them about that consider, an open cab tractor. Okay, an open cab tractor is going to be generating noise from the engine. Heat and cold, we're working inside of a greenhouse in August. We're out corn detasseling in southwestern Ontario in July. We're exposed to high heat and humidity. Cold, I'm in a dairy barn, and it's open. I need to ensure whatever that I'm properly protected to protect myself from that cold temperature. Vibration. Vibration could be, again, a forklift, a forklift being used in a pack house. You've got a forklift operator that is on that forklift for the duration of his shift. That individual, right? We know that the ground is not completely flat all throughout the facility, but I always reference that when the forklift is going into the trailer to load or unload, it's the vibration of the forklift going across the trailer bed floor. And then the other one would be radiation. Okay, radiation in the sense of being exposed to the sun if I'm working outside. Okay, we've got water on a greenhouse floor, so we know that we've already determined what physical is. What one would that be with the remaining hazard categories that are left? We've got safety. There we go. We do have safety. Okay, so that would be considered a safety hazard. So consider slips, trips, and falls. In regards to, a safety hazard would be a common one. I consider, water on a greenhouse floor. There could be a rut in the field where I could, trip forward. Falls. I've referenced scissor lifts that are used within the greenhouse industry. If the lift was to tip over from the heating rails, that could result in a fall from the worker, and that's going to be classified as a safety hazard category. Fertilizer. I think fertilizer would be pretty straightforward with the remaining hazard categories that we've got, correct? Okay, so we're going to be falling into the chemical hazard category. Fertilizers, fungicides, pesticides, also consider your WHMIS 2015 GHS control products. So if you do have, acids within the facility, fuel, maintenance shop, acetylene, oxygen, propane, that's going to fall into chemical hazard category. Standing while packing. Yeah, so musculoskeletal disorder. And just from the audience, familiarity with MSD, and how many of the attendees have some type of MSD prevention program in place, or MSD or providing MSD awareness to their staff? All right, so I've got some people that had said we do some training, we have awareness, we're doing job rotation. One of the things that, and I'm not the ergonomic specialist, we do have ergonomists on our team, but that's one of the things that we, whether it's the ergonomist or whether it's the consultant, that when we're out and we're talking to clients, we will ask that question: do you try to do job rotation? Is it possible to do that? That if we can do that, then we don't have that individual doing, the same repetitive job for the duration of their shift. And I do realize, everybody, at some places it's just not feasible for an operation to do that. But if we can't do the job rotation, that we're providing that awareness, we're providing some type of training to our staff members in regards to that. When we think, or when we talk about MSDs, I think the other important thing to remember is we talk about force, we talk about posture, we talk about duration, okay? That how much force is being exerted when I'm doing that job, okay? The posture, is it awkward posture? Is it overhead work that I'm doing, low work? Okay. And then the duration. How long am I doing that for the day? And I've seen this at various businesses where I've gone into, that if we do have somebody, standing, let's say, on a pack line, you're probably familiar with this, that, the business or the operation has purchased anti-fatigue mats for their staff. Okay. Bullying supervisor. We've got 2 left. Bullying supervisor. Yep. We've got psychosocial. When we talk about psychosocial, a number of years ago, psychosocial, the only thing really that we would speak to would be, violence and harassment. And now more and more, we're talking about psychosocial, we're talking about mental health. Not only do we speak to violence and harassment, but we're also talking about, stress. We're talking about anxiety. We're talking about, depression. And that all falls into that psychosocial hazard category. And then our final one, rodents. Think about bait traps that could be within the facility. That's going to fall into your biological. And that's just one example in regards to, an example for a biological hazard being rodents. Interesting enough, there's a lot of businesses that I'll work with that are in livestock, and they have needles for veterinary purposes. And if you think about a needle and you think about a sharps container, that's gonna fall into biological. Dee said there in the chat, inhaling mold. Can anybody think of any other types of biological hazards? We just kind of mentioned rodents. We mentioned the sharps containers. Mold has been referenced. Can you think of, there we go. That's what I was looking for. Celissa, yeah, you just said COVID. Okay. This was interesting that, if you go back to 2020, don't want to go back to 2020, but when I was out, when I was able to get out and I was doing work on site, this slide would come up for the, for my participants, that I would say, do we have any biological hazards that you need to be worried about here at the facility? And everyone would shake their head no. And then I would say to them, but group, what are we all wearing right now? We were all wearing our masks and practicing physical distancing when we were in the midst of the pandemic, and was just explaining to them that COVID would fall into a biological hazards. So we've got safety, physical, chemical, biological, MSD, and then finally psychosocial. Thanks, and I appreciate people utilizing the chat and providing some pertinent examples in regards to those hazard categories. So our hazard assessment, okay, we talk about the 4 parts of race. Okay, and I'm sure that probably most of the attendees are familiar with this acronym. Before we can do anything, okay, before we even begin the hazard assessment, we need to be able to recognize. Okay, so recognize those hazards that are present within the workplace. Our next step is then to assess. Okay, so we're going to assess to determine, what is the severity, and then find what our risk level is. Okay, so identifying existing or potential hazards, gathering information about the recognition of that particular hazard. We will determine the risk level. We're going to walk you through the risk evaluation chart in a couple of slides. Control. Okay, we want to be able to either eliminate or reduce the hazard. And once we have completed that control phase, we now need to evaluate. Okay, we need to check to see if the hazard has been eliminated altogether, or have we properly controlled that hazard, right, that we've identified. Okay, so recognizing, okay, learning about the hazard you've identified in the workplace by gathering the following information, as is mentioned here on the slide. We have interviews, so you could interview, the individuals that are doing that particular job or that task. Your health and safety documents, so your inspections that was mentioned earlier in regards to the Joint Health and Safety Committee. You could look at first aid documents, your investigation reports, manufacturer's specifications, okay, shift or maintenance logs, okay, and hazard alerts and bulletins. And I'll just ask a couple of questions in the chat in regards to not all of them that are up there, but first aid documents. Okay, first aid documents become very important, and when we're talking about first aid documents, there, your first aid log. Okay. That I mean, if you've got, which you would, you're going to have kits on site. That if something is being removed, from the first aid kit, I'm using the bandage, and the worker has to track that. That becomes very important in regards to the first aid log, because if you begin to see a pattern, that could help you to identify, hazards. Shift or maintenance logs, but in regards to, shift logs as well can become very important, because then we can determine, right, how long was the individual on the forklift, or how long was the individual on the tractor? What is the shift duration? Do we want to ensure whatever that fatigue is not setting in, right? That could be attributing to a particular hazard. In interviews, in particular, when I'm out, when Kristen's out, when we conduct the hazard assessments, you're with the person that is conducting that particular job or task, and you're asking, pertinent questions in regards to, what are the potential, hazards that you are concerned with, or what's the number one thing that keeps you up at night when you're doing this particular job? Because those are the individuals that, that are doing that on a regular basis. So they're going to be the ones that that know. Okay. And I always tell my CERT participants, that's another very valuable point to try to implement at your business, is that when they're going around and they're conducting their monthly workplace inspections, that, maybe talk to a couple of workers in various departments to gather that potential information to help you to recognize and identify those particular hazards. Okay. So when we're identifying individual tasks, okay, you want to consider both regular and infrequent tasks. Okay, a representative sample of the staff. I go back to 2022. I did a large HERA hazard identification risk assessment project for a client in Southwestern Ontario. That particular year, excuse me, we conducted 18 HERAs by position at this particular operation. And that was one of the things that when I was out and I was doing the data collection, I would sit down with the individual prior to going out onto the floor, and just kind of get a feeling as to what it was that individual did with their particular position. Then when I would observe some of the things that they did throughout the course of their shift. But one of the questions that I would ask before we would, end the data gathering, was there anything today in particular that I did not see? Was there anything or whatever that you may do throughout the course of the year? And the one position that I was thinking, sorry, the one position that I'm referencing at this particular operation was a shunt truck driver within the yard. And I remember him saying, well, one thing that you're not going to be able to see today, Jay, is you're here in August, hot summer day. But when I do have to hook up trailers from the loading docks at the warehouse during the winter months, it can get very icy in between the trailers. So those types of things to consider, that there is a potential slip, trip, and fall hazard for that worker, but it might only be identified during winter months. So maybe it's only going to be November, December, January, and February, but it would make him more prone to slip on the ice, as opposed to just slipping on the parking lot where the trailers were being docked near the loading dock. Okay, so the job title, the tasks that they conduct. When we're conducting the task analysis, that's going to help us to identify what types of hazards they could be associated. And when we break it down on our document, or the template that we use, as you're going through those assigned tasks, you're thinking about, are there psychosocial hazards present with this particular task? Is there safety? Is there MSD? Is there chemical, right? Is there biological? Is there physical that is associated? So the hazard assessment or the HERA itself, right, can get very lengthy because, based off of everything that they're doing, right, that's where we're trying to capture what 6 hazard categories are present as we move through the particular task that individual is conducting. This is our fishbone model. This is our PEMIP. So people, equipment, material, environment, and process. Okay. And the one thing that I would mention in regards to this model, okay, as you're working through, and if you're going to use this to identify, the root cause analysis of a particular hazard, you may not be able to enter data into each segment that is up there. And what I mean by that, I'm just going to bring them all up. In particular, the one that I'm focusing in on is environment, okay? And it says there, the environment, poor workplace layout and housekeeping, noise, hot or cold, poor lighting. Excuse me. If you're going through and you're using this and you've got an immaculate workplace, okay, there are no issues with noise. The temperature is fine, okay? And we do have proper lighting. That may be one that as we're working through it, and if we've identified this hazard, that could just be a not applicable. Sometimes when I've been out, people think that I've got to be able to put something into every box that is represented on that slide. That's not the case, okay? But when we're talking about people at the top, we're considering what is the individual doing or what are they not doing, okay? We talk about equipment that is not available. It's not adequate. It hasn't been maintained, okay? The HERA project, again, one other task that I had conducted was a forklift maintenance mechanic. This particular business had close to 80 forklifts on site. And when we completed that particular position, I remember asking the individual, was there anything again today that I did not see that you may do throughout the course of the year? And he said, yeah, August is always, I never look forward to August because they had close to 300 hand pump pallet jacks or pallet carts. And he said, yeah, in August, that's when I have to go through all of them. And I've got to, service them, and I've got to maintain them. And I remember him telling me that, and I've used it in other sessions, that, if we all go out and buy, right, a brand new handheld pump cart, and I'm going to use it to, pump up a couple of pallets, if it's brand new, okay, I'm not going to be exerting a lot of force, right, as I'm pumping that up. But if I was to, or the business was not to maintain that or service that, gradually over a couple of years, if it hasn't been properly lubricated and greased, I could be exerting more force in doing that particular job as opposed to what I was doing 2 years ago. And that could, right, contribute to, a hazard. So do we have a preventative maintenance program in place? Okay. We talk about material. Do we have defective materials? We don't have enough materials, wrong instructions. I've alluded to the environment, okay? But then the process, okay? Repetitive and monotonous tasks. So it's factoring into, again, possibly MSD, okay? Overtime, or do we have individuals that are working alone, right? Contributing factors and root cause analysis, the 5 why methods, okay? So our scenario here is a burnt out light bulb and a high traffic walkway, okay? So why was it not reported? Well, maintenance received the request, but no action was taken, okay? Why was it not replaced? Maintenance was out of light bulbs. Why were we out of bulbs? Okay. The purchasing clerk was off sick. Why not go to the store and use petty cash? know when to process since purchasing clerk handles the petty cash. Okay. Why no cross-training or backup person? Okay. And it says here, never thought of that. Never thought they would be off for a long period. Poor planning. Okay. I heard some people mention in the chat about doing the job rotation. Right. And we talk about, cross-training. And this was something that if we want to jump back to musculoskeletal, and we talk about MSDs, that some businesses have embraced this and they do the job rotation. But some businesses that we work with, they say, nope, this is what the individual is hired for, and this is what they're going to do. I'll just give you a little, tip that I noticed or whatever through the pandemic, and maybe some of the attendees in the audience were doing this for COVID reasons. Kristen, myself, others within the organization, we were heavily involved in this with WSPS and OMAFRA, the Ontario Ministry of Agricultural, Food and Rural Affairs. There was funding available for agricultural operations during the pandemic to assist them with COVID-19, whether it was developing policies, procedures, providing training, or in particular, two things that I'm thinking of were the COVID-19 gap analysis and the COVID-19 safety audit. And one of the things that was in both the safety audit and the gap analysis was, have you implemented some type of cross-training? Okay. Cross-training becomes very effective, and there were numerous businesses that, let's say, had 10 designated forklift operators, and it was a challenge to try and get the training done. But they realized we've got 10 designated forklift operators, but we're going to attempt to try and get 8 or another 10 trained on forklifts. Not necessarily to operate the forklift, but the cross training was done because they were concerned if there was an outbreak, right, in regards to COVID-19, and 8 of our 10 forklift operators were sick. Now we're down to 2. What are we going to do, right? So they were not that they were scrambling; they were being proactive in providing that type of cross training. Okay, so cross training becomes very effective in regards to if we talk about MSDs, reducing those potential MSD hazards within the workplace. We do the assessment phase. Right? So that's the process of evaluating an identified workplace hazard to determine the extent and the severity of the hazard. Okay. Now you want to compare that against hazards, against laws, standards, and guidelines that apply to your workplace. I'm just going to open up the chat, and I'm just going to pose a question. I know it's not on the slide, but I'm going to pose a question to my audience. Do I have any participants in the room where it is a requirement for certain jobs or tasks that your staff members may do, that when they're doing that particular job or task, they are required to wear hearing protection? Does anybody have anybody where they're, yes, okay. And is there a particular set of legislation or a law that speaks to noise within the Occupational Health and Safety Act? Yes, there is. Okay, so it's Ontario's noise regulation. Okay, so there's where we can compare, right, against particular. So Vanessa, just so you know, okay, this changed a couple of years ago, right? There used to be a particular, thanks, Rick. There used to be a section within Reg 851 for industrial establishments that spoke to noise. There was a new regulation that came in, though, 381, and speaks specifically to noise, and that does, okay, that noise regulation does apply to agricultural operations. So, if we're doing an assessment as to how noisy is it in this particular area, or how noisy is it on that open cab tractor, and it is higher than 85 dB if I'm going to be on the tractor for the entire day, there then becomes a requirement to ensure that those individuals are wearing hearing protection. So don't only look at your internal policies and procedures. We also need to ensure whatever that we're looking at the applicable legislation that applies to our workplace. Okay. You assess the risk, and then you prioritize which hazards to work on first. And we've put this in here in particular, just so everybody is aware, okay? And I'm sure everybody is. But under legislation for, workplace violence, okay, and harassment in particular, there is a requirement to ensure that a workplace violence risk assessment is conducted by the business. And the reason that we've kind of bolded this in my dealings with the various inspectors that I know out of the Windsor office and out of the London office, if we meet for coffee, and what's the hot button topic, or what's the common thing that you're seeing when you're going out there and you're visiting these businesses, all the inspectors are always saying, Jay, when you're doing any type of training, or you're doing, let's say like today, a safety connection, stress the importance to the participants that there is a requirement to conduct that workplace violence risk assessment, because some of the inspectors have said they get out to a place, business has the workplace violence policy, business has the workplace harassment policy. Okay, they've got a written program for both violence, and they've got a written program for harassment. Okay, so it's pen to paper. It's not up in the air. It's pen to paper. Here's the policies and procedures. This is what we're doing at this particular business. Training's being provided. And then they're asking, can I see your workplace violence risk assessment? And they've said, some businesses are like, we've never heard of that. We don't have one of those. And then an order is being left by the inspector to ensure that that workplace violence risk assessment is conducted. Okay, so just a takeaway or a debrief. Just do a double check. If you don't, there will be an email that is sent out following the session with resources, and that is one that is included. You can just click on the link. You can go to the ministry's site, and then you can conduct that workplace violence risk assessment. So our methods, again, we're still in the assessment phase. We gather the information, so inspections. Okay, we don't want to be conducting investigations, but if we do have to conduct an internal investigation, if it is for a critical or a lost time injury, that information or whatever that we've captured on our forms will help us in assessing those hazards. That job hazard analysis. Okay. The observations, watching the individual, what is that individual doing when they're performing that particular job or task. Again, interviews. Okay, interviews become very important, because then that information is going to be shared with you of the individual that is doing that particular task. And then exposure monitoring, whether it's indoor air quality testing, okay, or whether it is conducting a noise assessment. Right. I just had a debrief call yesterday afternoon with a client. I had conducted a noise assessment in January for a township for their both their public works and their volunteer fire department. And it was a very unique one in regards to that exposure monitoring, because those individuals were not necessarily doing the same job day after day. So it wasn't just a forklift operator or a tractor operator for the duration of their shift, or someone on the pack line. Use of chainsaw, use of string line trimmer, use of a quick cut saw, angle grinder, sawzall. Fire department, the chief just had to be able to demonstrate some of the tools that could possibly be used when they're conducting, responding to a call, is what I meant to say. But in particular, what we broke down was looking at the sound level measurements and reinforcing to them, yep, I realize the guys may only be using the chainsaw when a couple of trees fall down within the township on a road. But we need to ensure they might only be doing it for, half an hour, 45 minutes, but based off of the decibel reading on that particular chainsaw, just reinforcing to them, right, there would be a requirement to ensure that we're wearing hearing protection. So not only for the noise, but also for, potential indoor air quality or other types of testing that could be done. We've got our legislation. So we've got our laws. We've got the Occupational Health and Safety Act. We've got our regulations. So we've got our noise regulation. We have regulations for farming. Some businesses that may be in the room. You could be both 414, which is farming. You could also, certain parts of the business may adhere to Regulation 851. If you're not familiar with it, the Ministry of Labor, excuse me, Immigration, Training and Skills Development. A lot of us still just refer to them as the MOL. But in 2006, when agricultural operations did come under the Act, June 30th of 2006, very limited regulations in farming. But what they also put forward was guidelines. And you see those guidelines that are referenced there on the slide, occupational health and safety guidelines for farming operations in Ontario. And it does speak to, occupational illness. It speaks to, farm equipment. It speaks also to, working at heights. If you're not going to follow something from Reg 851, to demonstrate due diligence and as best practice, right, adhere to and utilize those guidelines that the ministry put forward. We have CSA standards. There could be industry standards within your various businesses that where you work at. Industry standards, what we're kind of referring to there is, it could be something that the Canadian Manufacturers Association has like a set standard across the board. Something possibly that Ontario greenhouse vegetable growers might put out something as an industry standard, or the Ontario Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association. Your own internal policies and procedures. Professional standards. So think professional standards in regards to an engineering report, and then manufacturer and supplier guidelines recommendations. Various things to compare when we're going through that assessment phase. Okay. We get into one of the most important, important aspects of the assessment phase. And this is where we're looking at probability and the severity to determine the risk level. And you might have something internal that you use. Terminology might change from probability to likelihood. How likely is this job being done, or how often is this job being done? Okay. But when we look at the probability, consider again, is it a regular tractor operator, forklift operator, or is it I only push snow or have to remove snow 3 months out of the year? Or based off of, where you live within the province. If you're down in Southern Ontario and you're down in the Leamington and Kingsville area, maybe it's only sporadic, right? Maybe it's like, a month out of the year where we get a significant amount of snow. I always joke, with participants in that area when I'm down there to do training, how many of you in the room have snow tires? And I might have a class of 20 and maybe only 2 hands go up. But if you live in London, where I live, it's common practice. We're in the snowbelt area. Everyone in the city of London, the majority, I guess I should say, has snow tires. So what's the probability? The severity. How serious could the injury or illness be? And with that one there, this is where it becomes very subjective. Okay? Because when we're talking about severity, and I'm going to open this up into the chat. If I'm climbing a grain bin, if I'm climbing a elevator leg, and I don't have the proper protection, and I fall, how serious could that be? What's just using the chat? What's the first thing that kind of jumps to everybody's mind? Worker falls off of a grain elevator. Yeah, okay. Rick, excellent. Okay. Critical injury or fatality. Don says death. Critical. Okay. Now, if I'm at a facility and the storage area for parts is up on the mezzanine, and I've been tasked to go grab a couple of boxes of parts, and now I'm coming down that stairwell, and I'm not using the handrail. And if I was to slip or fall forward, what do you think is going to happen? What potentially could happen? Could it still result in another critical? Could it possibly result in a fatality? Okay. This is where it gets very subjective, right? In regards to the severity, okay? Whether I'm doing this, whether I'm doing CERT training, I always say this, maybe it's because I'm the safety consultant, and I always think worst case scenario. And I remember a client a number of years ago saying to me, "What are you, a fear monger? Like, do you literally walk around all the time and think worst case scenario?" And my response or my reply was, "Yeah." And if I'm not doing that, I'm not doing my job. Okay. Now that's the severity. Okay. But then we're also factoring in the probability, which is this is going to help us determine what the risk level is. Okay. So as we bring up our risk evaluation chart, okay. Okay. And I am the same way. I like that. Right. So not that we're fear mongers, but we're just trying to get across, right, that the results could be the same. Okay. The probability, right? There's probably a higher probability if I'm not wearing fall protection of falling off that grain elevator, right? Where the result could be the same on the stairwell, right? But the probability might be possibly a little bit lower. Okay, so here we go into our risk evaluation chart, and I'll come back to that question there in a second. But you'll notice here, if we have a probability of medium and we have a severity of injury being major, our risk evaluation chart then tells us we've got a high, okay, high risk level, right? We talk about technical hazard assessments, okay, that could be done. Machine guarding and robotics. Okay. We have within the organization machine safety and robotics specialists. Okay. Consider lockout tagout. Okay. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the term lockout tagout. You probably have a maintenance individual or a maintenance department, and they're the ones that are tasked with doing repairs. Question that I'll ask of participants when I'm doing other sessions. If the tractor breaks down, if the forklift goes awry, if the box making machine's not operating properly, do you troubleshoot on your own? And most of the participants will say, no, we're not to do that. We're to contact our supervisor. Supervisor will contact the maintenance department, and maintenance will come in, right? And they will do that work. Okay. Confined space, ergo. So ergonomic assessment, noise. We talk about our chemicals. You're familiar with safety data sheets to check your safety data sheets to ensure whatever that you've got the proper first aid measures or first aid protocols in place. Clients will ask at various venues, whether it's a trade show, whether it's in training. Do I need, an eye wash station? Do I need an emergency shower station? And one of the things that I'll point out to them is, well, what types of possible chemicals do you have on site, right? We want to be taking a look at that safety data sheet in advance to ensure that we've got those measures in place, as opposed to something happens, we run to the safety data sheet and it says, oh, we need to flush our eyes with water for 15 to 20 minutes. I should have had that, that plumbed in eye wash station in place. I mentioned violence and harassment, which falls into your psychological or psychosocial safety, and then as well pedestrian traffic safety assessments. Those are technical hazard assessments that are conducted. Okay. All right. So now it says how many so many high hazards. Now what? Okay. Focus on hazards based on your hazard score. Okay. You saw there on that risk evaluation chart that it was major, moderate, or minor, or high, medium, low. You might have something internally where you go color code. When we do work for clients and we're doing a HERA that's been requested of us, it is color coded. Extreme is like a very, very bright red. High is orange, medium is a yellow, and low is white. I've seen other ones that clients have shared. They go by an ABC, a 1, 2, 3. Okay. The one thing that I find with involving the color, when that report goes back or the debrief is conducted with the client, I think we all gravitate towards a bright red. Okay, that's telling them or whatever. Oh, this was listed as extreme. We need to do something right away. We need to put something in place. Okay, okay. Divide and conquer with internal expertise. Go to those individuals. You've done the assessment phase, but go to those individuals now and ask him or her, do you have any ideas, solutions? What types of controls could we put in place? Okay. Utilize your health and safety representative or your joint health and safety committee. Okay. And then you can harness outside expertise to create additional hazard management capacity. Just not a plug. Okay. But I don't think a lot of people realize that workplace safety and prevention services, we look after everybody that is agriculture, we look after manufacturing, and we look after service. And we have various specialists on my team, on Kristen's team within the organization. Expertise, okay? You're not familiar with noise. You're not familiar with MSDs or ergonomics. You're not familiar with confined space, okay? There is a tool, right? A resource as us that you can utilize. If you just need to ask a question, we can put you in contact with a confined space specialist. We can put you in contact with an occupational hygienist. We can put you in contact with an ergonomist, okay? I always tell individuals when I'm doing any type of public training, you got a question, reach out to me. I'll put you in contact with them. They'll come out. They'll take a look. They'll provide that feedback to you. And there's no charge for that. If you need them to actually like write a report, or when I just mentioned yesterday, had a debrief, that particular township had asked us to conduct a noise assessment. There is a cost for that. But if they would have just, reached out and said, Jay, can you come to the, public works maintenance shop and just give us, your 2 cents on, do you think it's noisy in here? Should we be wearing hearing protection? There's no charge for that. Okay, that's part of the transfer payment agreements between the health and safety associations and the Ministry of Labor. So if you're kind of like stuck, right, you don't know, feel free, right, to reach out to our organization. Okay, all right, our controls. The control is how you are going to eliminate or minimize, okay, the hazard. There may be legislated or regulatory controls for your work. Okay. As one that's mentioned there, wearing seatbelts in vehicles on the highway. Okay, that falls under the Highway Traffic Act. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. We're not wearing a seatbelt. Police officer pulls us over, we're going to get a ticket. Okay, but the controls must adequately control all hazards. Okay, protect all those workers who are likely to be exposed, and not create any new hazards. And in particular, when we get to the evaluation phase, that's what we're looking at. We want to ensure that once we put a control in place, we haven't created any additional hazards in regards to that control that we've implemented. Okay. So when developing a control strategy, consult legislation, standards, and guidelines. Okay. And this is our hierarchy of controls. And it says elimination, substitution, engineering, awareness, administrative, personal protective equipment. And it says there, some controls are more effective than others. And I'm going to ask individuals in the chat to provide their 2 cents on that question. Why do you think that might be? Why are some controls more effective than others? Aaron says employee buy-in. Yeah. And I'm going to focus in on the employee, and I'm going to say the following. Okay. And Dee Dee says people take shortcuts, ease of use. Here's just a couple of examples. I go out and do a noise assessment. Client reaches out, says, "Can you do one? We want to determine if it's noisy in here." Let's say we got a shop, there's a noisy piece of equipment in the corner. We got all the workers working in there, and it's over 85, and they're going to be working in there for 8 hours. And I'll provide them with the data following the assessment, and I'll say, preliminary data tells us that it's going to be higher. And a lot of businesses right away will gravitate towards, okay, that means we got to go buy hearing protection. And when we do the debrief with them after, when the report comes back, one of the things that we mentioned to them is, what about an engineering control? Is there a way that we can enclose that noisy area to eliminate the noise, or to not eliminate, but to muffle the noise where it lowers it below the 85, as opposed to just going out and purchasing hearing protection? Because when we look at the PPE, and when Aaron said employee buy-in, we're relying on the employees to comply, right? So we might say to them, yes, there's a policy here, and here's the hearing protection you're supposed to wear, but can we guarantee that all workers at all times are going to be wearing the hearing protection? Okay. Where we could probably, go with an engineering control, right? Where then it's enclosed, right? And then we're not relying, right? Okay. Yeah, and plus they possibly can't hear when they got the hearing protection on. Now, a lot of the times though, everybody, when you're looking at this, it's very rare to eliminate the hazard altogether. Okay? Unless we just get rid of that piece of equipment. But I'm going to give you an example, okay, where it has happened. And probably unlike most in the room, you didn't get an email on March 14th of 2020, as well as a phone call, as well as a text message saying, we've been notified by head office, WSPS, that we're working from home for the next 2 weeks. So that was March 14th of 2020. And I finally got back out in the field July 8th of 2020 to head down to Leamington to go do some COVID-19 tailgate talks for some temporary foreign agricultural workers. My point is, from March 14th until July 7th, my number one hazard pre-pandemic or pre-email, text message, phone call was driving. So for work-related purposes, from March 14th of 2020 until July 7th, that hazard was eliminated altogether for work. I still drove to the grocery store on the weekends. Okay? But it's very rare that we could eliminate. Okay? Now you could substitute in the form of, let's say we've got chemicals, maybe we use something less hazardous. Okay? Engineering, enclosing the area. I'm not making light of COVID, but I will say this, that COVID provided me as a facilitator with pertinent examples for hierarchy of controls. We all saw engineering controls throughout the pandemic when you went to the grocery store, right? You went to the drugstore, you went to the liquor store, you went to checkout, there was that plexiglass barrier in between, right? The cashier and ourselves. Awareness in regards to the pandemic, we saw it all over the place. Practice physical distancing, the arrows within the grocery store, okay? That's awareness. So signage, administrative, various places that I went to in 2020, 2021, even into 2022, required to fill out, a COVID-19 screening questionnaire. So administrative falls into policies and procedures, okay? And then, right, your PPE, okay? So whether it was the mask, whether it's hearing protection, whether it's eye protection, hard hat, okay? Whether it's steel-toed footwear, right? But just remember, okay, we always want to start at the top and work our way down, okay? Let's just not run right to, okay, well, here's the easiest way to fix it. We're just going to make sure that everybody wears the proper personal protective equipment, okay? When we talk about the location of controls, three steps. We want to try and control them at the source. If I can't control them at the source, I'm going to try to control it along the path. Okay, and that could be, proper ventilation. Okay, within the area. If it was places that I've been to before, paint booths, they've got that proper ventilation to, suck the paint fumes out of the booth, right? And then as well at the worker. Okay, but we always want to focus first at the source. If we can't do it at the source, we're going to do it along the path. And if we can't do it along the path, then we're going to focus in on the worker. Okay. And as it says there, controls at the source are always preferred. Comprehensive risk control. Multiple contributing factors require multiple multiple controls to minimize the risk. Okay, so you could have the engineering followed by the awareness in regards to signage, and then administrative. Okay, it's not always just one control. Okay, so consider that. Again, our PEMIP. Okay, we talk about people, improve individual decision making. Training, mentorship, respect individual limitations. Seeing this more and more. I like that word there, mentorship. I'm seeing this a lot with young workers coming into the into the business. Yes, they've got a supervisor that they are to report to, but more and more businesses are telling that new individual, and Joe, he's not your supervisor, but he's going to be your mentor. If the supervisor's not around, go to that individual. Okay, make the equipment safer, eliminate pinch points, provide ergonomic tools, lift gates on vehicles, just as an example. Material. Choose safer material, lighter containers, non-toxic chemicals, less awkward positions, simpler to use tools. Environment, okay, change the environment. Okay, install non-slip flooring, ventilation, electrical outlets where needed. That's proper lighting would be another one. Temperature within the environment, and then as well the process. Improve the system, daily task hazard assessment, maintenance plans, procurement, safety plan, and that's going to assist in regards to helping you to put forward those controls. Okay. We now come back and we do our evaluation. So we put the controls in place. Okay. We determine how well the controls work, estimate the risk again, identify any new hazards. So the evaluation steps, again, very similar when we were doing the assessment phase. How likely is the hazard to cause injury or illness now after we've put a control? Is it high? Is it medium? Is it low? How serious could the harm be? Major, moderate, or minor? And now what is our risk level? Is it going to be high, medium, or low? Okay. And this is where I always stress this, okay? Before, when you saw the risk evaluation chart, when we showed it the first time, our probability of injury in that example was medium. Okay. Now, let's say we've put in a control or multiple controls. Our probability of injury now has moved from a medium to a low, but our severity stays the same. Okay, our severity is still a major. So we don't have a risk of a high. We've now moved it to a medium. And it's interesting sometimes when I'm coaching in regards to hazard assessments, or there's a session that is conducted about this in CERT, how some people think, okay, well, I've put all these controls in place, so the probability of injury is going to be low, but they also think that that's going to move their severity, that it might go down to a moderate or it could go down to a minor. And the answer or the point is no. Unless that hazard has been eliminated altogether, your severity is going to stay the same. It's your probability of injury that's going to be reduced based off of the controls. Okay? I can put all those controls in place. Okay? But if something still goes wrong, the severity of injury is going to be major. So you've got an individual, as an example, that is using an angle grinder in the shop. You do the hazard assessment. You determine, well, you know what? If he or she's not wearing eye protection and something flies up right into their eye, okay, that could result in a serious injury. Okay, that could be a risk level of high. Don't just assume though that, oh, now we're going to provide eye protection, that's going to lower it to a moderate. The result would be the same, because as well, it was mentioned earlier, we're relying on that worker to wear that. Okay, And there could be a possibility that even though he or she's wearing the eye protection, that something flies up underneath the eye protection and gets into their eye. Okay. So just remember that unless the hazard has been eliminated altogether, okay, your severity will stay the same based off of your assessment. In the evaluation component, it's the probability of injury that would change based off of the controls that you've put in place. Your assessment maintenance, okay, be sure to regularly review and update the hazard assessment. You got changes to jobs or tasks. Okay. New equipment comes in or processes. Renovations being conducted at the facility, or you've moved to a new location. New roles, world events. Maybe they're alluding to what happened 4 years ago. Okay. And have a periodic cycle, okay, at regular intervals, right, to conduct those reviews. But in particular, yeah, like a new piece of equipment comes in, okay. I always think about, the tractor safety awareness sessions that I conduct. And when I first started, a number of years ago at Farm Safety Association before the merger, some of my previous colleagues that I used to work with, they would conduct, a tractor session on site with a farmer, but it was both practical and theory. And I was familiar with the tractors that I worked with on the farm when I was going through university, but like I posed this to, our CEO at the time and said, every tractor is different. Okay. So you got a new piece of equipment that comes in, technology changes over, 4 or 5 years. Maybe that tractor you purchased in 2000, now you've purchased one in, 2024. I want to take a look at that. Are there any new nuances or uniquenesses about this particular piece of equipment when I'm conducting that hazard assessment? I kind of talked about some of this, our resources, just again, right? If you need, I'll say it like this. If you need us to do the work, there's a charge for that. If you need consultation and advice, right? You want to reach out and have an ergonomist come in. You want to have the machine safety robotic specialist come in, the pedestrian traffic safety specialist, an occupational hygienist. You're going to take the notes. You just need to get some advice. There's no charge for that. Okay. But if you need us to do the work, right, because you need to be able to generate something and show this to your senior leadership or your employer, then yeah, that's when there becomes a fee. You're here today for hazard assessments in agriculture. Kristen and I, when we were doing our prep earlier this week, there's some upcoming safety connections that may be beneficial to you. Whether you're in the agricultural sector or whether you're not, there's an upcoming one on noise awareness, roadmap to mental harm prevention, talking about psychosocial hazards. Employer reports an MSD disorder. Now what? Okay, this is where everybody kind of gets into scramble mode, but ergonomist is going to be speaking to that. And then one that would tie in and help you with what we kind of discussed this morning is leveling up your workplace inspection game. Okay, how to how to strengthen in identifying those hazards. One of the things that I always stress in CERT training, when we're talking about our workplace inspection template that WSPS provides, there's an actual area on there that says observation or interviewed who. And I go back to a number of years ago when there used to be the WSIB Work Well program. And this was not a legislative requirement. This was a WSIB Work Well requirement, but they required that the monthly workplace inspections, there had to be either an observation written down or an employee interviewed. As well, they also required that supervisors do quarterly inspections, and that they wanted the owner to do at least 2 inspections throughout the course of the year. There were a couple of clients that had to go through the WorkWell process, and they adhered to what they had to do, so they didn't receive the surcharge. But I remember one in particular making the comment afterwards, a lot of this stuff we thought was, a little over the top, but we did it because we had to comply. But one of the things that we're going to keep moving forward is having the supervisors continue to conduct their inspections, having the owner out on the floor, and we're gonna ensure, right, that at least one staff member or worker is interviewed when the worker representative of the committee is out on the floor conducting that, just to have that interaction and that dialogue. Okay. Excuse me. And I would also say this as well. This has happened numerous times for me. I'm on site. I'll do a session. Session maybe is about an hour and a half, 2 hours. Excuse me. I wrap up. I'll say to the group, are there any questions? There's like no questions from anybody. I'll say, okay, thanks everybody for your time. Have a great rest of your day. And I'm up at the front and I'm packing up, and someone will come walking up and they'll ask a question. Okay. And just consider this or whatever, that you might have tailgate talks or huddle talks with your staff in the morning. Maybe the supervisor poses a question. Maybe there are some workers or whatever that will ask a question or mention something about a hazard. Just realize that there's certain individuals that just don't feel comfortable in speaking up in front of their fellow peers. They may be more prone to open up if it is that one-on-one. And that allows then for both the workplace inspections or when you're doing your hazard assessment to have that one-on-one discussion. Additional resources, and these will be sent to you. Cert Part 1 I've referenced, Cert Part 2. We do have a course in regards to managing hazards. There is a course specifically geared towards greenhouses. This has been around now for 2 years. It's called Safety, Health, and Law for greenhouses. Additional resources on our web. The Agricultural and Horticultural Safety Center. We've got how to identify and assess your hazards. So there's a hazard assessment tool video, instructions, and then finally, if you don't have one, there is a hazard assessment template. And all these resources that are listed here, I mean, you can click on them, but this will be sent out to you via email following the session. And there's that guide to the Occupational Health and Safety Act for farming operations. One in particular, because some of the businesses here within the session, you may not be required to have a joint health and safety committee. And if you don't fall into greenhouse, dairy, beef, poultry, mushroom, or swine, if you're an orchard, you're a cash crop grower, a nursery, once you get over that magic number of 6, there becomes a requirement to have a health and safety representative. So that speaks to the requirements on farming operations, general health and safety and farming operations. You always want to find the current and most up-to-date piece of legislation. I always direct participants or clients to e-laws. And with that, just open up the chat. It looks like most people were wondering about, do I get the slides? And they can't be shared due to copyright, but the recording will be available in a couple of weeks. And Kristen, anything to add? Did I miss anything?
No, there is an interesting comment within the chat, just to note the comment that a lot of farms are using robotics now, and an opinion in this moment, perhaps, if the sector will need to revamp procedures to be more comparable with industrial requirements. So I'll make a comment, and then please do, Jay. Simply that although we do not have prescription or specific requirements within the sector for not only machine safety, but a variety of hazard exposures, there is still that expectation that the equipment, materials, etc. within a workplace are safe and not likely to result in harm to employees. So We do see orders written related to machine safety, such as robotics, under general duty expectations for the employer and or supervisor. So reasonable precaution with robotics may be to implement appropriate safeguards. Jay, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just if they're still there, RSFO QC, who posed the question. To Kristen's point, yeah, if you go into, and you probably have, Reg 414 for farming, there's very limited regulations. And I have a lot of clients over the years that they've said, but Jay, I don't have to do that. That's industrial, that's that. But Kristen just hit it right on the head. It's the general duty clause. If you're not going to adhere to something from Reg 851, and God forbid something happens, the ministry can never go into a farm and reference Reg 851 if Reg 851 does not pertain. But what they're going to get that business, I don't want to say get, what they will issue the order to the business was, you failed to take every precaution reasonable for the protection of the worker. It's a very interesting question in regards to robotics entering that sector, autonomous vehicles within the sector, autonomous tow carts that don't have the answer. But just again, keep in mind, June 30th, 2006 is when farms come under the act. All right, we're coming up on 18 years of farms being under the act. There could be something down the pipe that the ministry goes to OFA, goes to the commodity associations and says, possibly maybe it's time to revisit, updating relevant legislation for agricultural operations. And Julie said, what's the date?
And that may have been the date that the legislation became applicable that you referenced.
Okay.
The 18-year anniversary.
June 30th, 2006. Hopefully that's the, and I think I'll see Julie next week. Well, if there's no other questions, I hope everybody has a great rest of the afternoon, and I hope that there's no snow in where you're at, because there's a ton of snow in London, and they're calling for 2 to 4 inches tomorrow, Kristen.
So true. So true. Thanks so much, everyone. We appreciate your involvement in the session. Take care.